He didn't see that. Okay, I apologize to those who were waiting. I didn't see that you were there. So the story of Rabbi Akiva is this famous story of Moses atop of Mount Sinai, and the whole beginning of the story is that Moses sees God putting crowns on the letters of the Torah. Moses says, "What are they for?" God says, "There's a guy named Akiva who will interpret even the crowns." Moses says, "Let me see him." He's now transferred about 2 centuries into the future. He sits in Rabbi Akiva's yeshiva, and he's very impressed, and so impressed that he doesn't even understand what Rabbi Akiva is teaching, though Rabbi Akiva attributes it to all that he's teaching to Moses. And Moses goes back to God and says to God, "Such a great scholar, what was his reward?" And Moses is then moved again to the Roman period, where he sees the Akiva being tortured. And Moses says, "What's this? Such a great scholar, and this is his end?" And the end of that story is really very important. God says, "Shut up. It's not for you to know." So much for the Talmud's dealing with reward and punishment. But Moses is horrified by Rabbi Akiva's end. Our author tells us that people see the world from their own perspective, and the example he gives is rain can ruin a party, and that's seen as terrible. Right? You got snow in the mountains, right? So you can't go over the pass, but the farmer sees it differently. So the issue is and so his claim is that evil emanates from our self-centeredness. The answer is to liberate oneself from this egotistic point of view. If only we could liberate ourselves, we would both understand evil and not consider it evil. All right, so now he tells us in this chapter that we're going to stop and get your impressions in a minute, but that there's only 3 sources of evil in the world. There's evil caused by nature. Number 2, evil that harm that we do to each other in interpersonal relations. And the 3rd is evil we do to ourselves. So he tells us that this injury that's caused by nature includes illness and sickness and natural disasters, hurricanes, earthquakes, etc., which he says are rare. But most of us are healthy and not subject to earthquakes. And so, since they are rare, we should make peace with them. You satisfied with that? That's number 2 is issues of crime and war, which he says is also rare. War is more widespread than crime, and perhaps we should include here political abuse. And he says that's more prevalent than natural disasters, but it's also pretty rare. Then most of us are not subject to these kinds of painful things. And the 3rd is evil that's caused by bad habits, what we do to ourselves. We are, as humans, prone to sensual satisfaction, which he gives two examples: food and sexual licentiousness. We can include all kinds of things in there. We eat bad foods. We're subject to gluttony, and we surrender ourselves to physical desires to excess. The closer evil is to us, the more common it is. So the first kind of evil is the least common, that which comes from natural disasters. The second is more frequent, that which we as human beings do to each other. And the third is the most frequent of all, but human beings are not hapless victims, but we are the main source of our own evil. Maybe we'll stop here. Any thoughts on these, on the way he's dealt with evil? He's basically defined evil away. That it's God is not the source of it. Nature is the source of it, and that's not very common. How we abuse our. And any thoughts on Barbara?
Oh, Lee had his hand up before I did. Why
okay, Lee.
I'll go next.
Lee, where are you? Oh, there you are.
There we go. Looking at it from the helper perspective, you don't blame people for what happens to them. You try and have them cope with it. You accept people as they are. You don't refuse care to people with substance abuse. You don't turn away people from the emergency room if they haven't been vaccinated or refuse to take care of them. So that's the idea. The idea now, the idea at his time was to accept people's weakness and say, that's just the way they are. So we've progressed, I think, since.
Have we?
Maybe.
I'm not sure that we really have. With what is it? 80 million people are still unvaccinated, and 80 million Americans still unvaccinated.
Well, I think looking at that, there's all kinds of reasons why people don't get vaccinated. Suspicion of what the government is telling you to do, political ideas.
Sure.
And I think we're going to be stuck now in some countries. There's much higher rates of immunizations. Interestingly enough, those are countries that have government-sponsored healthcare, and so there's not the suspicion, and perhaps more equity. There's a lot of disequity, if that's a word, in this country about healthcare.
So what I wanted
go ahead, Barbara.
What I wanted, the story that you just told about Moses and Akiva, I would love the same thing to know what would be if Maimonides were transferred 1,000 years in the future and took a look at our world now, because the things that he's talking about don't seem to apply 1,000 years forward. He did not experience the Holocaust. He did not experience what's going on now with global warming and the world falling apart climatically. So I would love to see and how people are thinking now, 1,000 years in the future and all of that. That's my main question to him is, how do you say all these things in light of what's happened in the ensuing 1,000 years? Because I can't agree with anything that he said in light of where we live today.
Are you familiar with this Harvard professor named, is his name Pinker? And he wrote a book that I was very, very interested in which he says that over time, the war and horrible things that human beings do to each other has progressively lessened. And he
Yes.
and he includes in that the the Holocaust. Given the number of people, that we were much more brutal to each other in former times. We look at the Holocaust and we as a terrible horror, which it was. But maybe in the big picture, it's a little different. Lisa?
Yeah, when I read this, my overall impression from this is he comes out and he says, the more you perfect yourself, the closer to God or you get. And it just reminded me of Siddhartha and some of those books about people who meditate, and it's not sort of an active in the world sort of thing, but an intellectual movement towards God. And that's not exactly what he's saying, but it certainly reminded me of some of those Eastern philosophies.
Well, certainly Buddhism is focused almost exclusively on the issue of suffering. It's really so central. I don't know if it's similar to Buddhism, but maybe we'll have to think about that for a little bit. But he is saying that much of this is in our perception and our control, which I think is pretty an interesting idea. That it's hurricanes and illness are part of the rules of nature. Yeah, God is the source of the rules of nature, but we have to live with it. And the worst is our own stupidity in how we live. In what was it was wait a minute. What was it? It was was my previous page. Food and sexual licentiousness. Can we say that that's the source of all of our issues? Food and sexual licentiousness. I think that covers a lot, by the way. Alan?
Yes, I think on page 48, Maimonides hits on a sentence that can go central to how we look at things. The sentence in the book, and this author says, is, for the merchant who makes dangerous sea voyages, he is not responsible for the storm, but he is responsible for his decision to go to sea. And so what Maimonides is positing is a personal responsibility for everything that happens to me.
Well, first of all, it's a very interesting example in that that's exactly the crisis that he faces with his brother. And yeah, we take risks. Walk down the street, there's certain risks of being a pedestrian. Every time we get in a car, we get into an airplane, and he would say that, if God forbid, an airplane crashes, you knew the risks. And if you didn't want to take risks, you shouldn't have gotten on the airplane. I think there's some aspects of this that are a brilliant way to take responsibility away from God for all of these things. So he goes on to say that to attain unnecessary we are we put ourselves in harm's way, as we just described, to attain unnecessary luxuries. And then when things don't go well, we blame God. We choose to take risks. We are not victims. We are responsible for the consequences of our choices. And therefore, he shifts the source of evil or trouble from God to us and explains it away. Next, he deals with suffering of the soul or psychological pain. And what is the source of the suffering of the soul? It's the pursuit of happiness is the source of our emotional or psychological suffering. Our lust for sensory pleasure, for wealth, for honor, for power is insatiable. So that's, his view of society then, probably not so different from society today. It's not the existence of desire that's the problem, but the way that desire tends to grow. We have an expression in Jewish expression, mitzvah goreret mitzvah, aveira goreret aveira. If you do mitzvah, you're on track to do another mitzvah. If you if you get away with some sin, you're more likely to do another sin. So here he says desire is the problem is not desire, but the fact that desire tends to grow, and therefore Maimonides is not negating desire, but to cultivate desire that's in tune with reality. Avoid frustration by reassuring one's expectations. I'm not reassuring, reassessing. Avoid frustration by reassessing one's expectations. In other words, what's the someone describes they're in emotional pain, and the response they get is, "Oh, pull yourself together," which is really not an appropriate response. But that which causes us emotional pain, says Maimonides, is self-inflicted. Through knowledge of the world, we can experience harmony and avoid suffering. Any thoughts on that about? Yeah, Mark.
Yes, as you're sort of recounting that and what he said, when I was reading it, it reminded me a lot of even what I've read from Stoicism. So what really distinguished his philosophy here, other than putting in the context of how God can exist and there be evil, et cetera, is there really much distinction between some of the earlier philosophy that was already there?
In many ways, he is, as we said from the very beginning, he's putting Judaism, people who have been reading and subject to the thoughts of the day, philosophical thoughts of the day, and they wonder, why is Judaism backward? Why is Judaism? And he is now not justifying, but what's the word that I'm looking for? Sort of trying to make it coordinate. That with the philosophy of the day, that's what Judaism always believed, right? He's really not claiming to invent anything new, He's saying these ideas are Jewish. Don't think that these ideas are foreign. They are authentically Jewish from the very beginning. So, I mean, I think the idea is there's certain ideas that we have about Judaism today that we attribute way back. We attribute back to centuries ago, perhaps even to the Talmudic period or the biblical period. And that's not what they believed at all. But we have an intellectual need to both make our ideas and have them fit together. I think it was Harold Schulweis in one of his books. He said, "You shouldn't leave there shouldn't be a need to leave your mind at the front of the synagogue before you walk in." In other words, there should be you should have consistency between your ideas and your practice of Judaism. That's a challenge, and that was his challenge. Trudy?
What he's saying, I think, is when bad things happen to good people, it's really your own fault. But how does that explain how good things happen to bad people?
Well, partly what he's saying is it's our definition of evil. And we're going to get back to that near the end of the chapter. What we define as evil is a self-centered idea. That we look at evil through our own eyes, and others don't see it as evil. I just thought of a horrible example. I'm not going to share it.
Thank you.
9/11, we declared as evil. That human beings would, but there were others. There were others for whom that act was celebrated. Now that's hard for us to understand, and we reject that. But it's the fact. Okay. He then uses as his example Job's what he claims his reading of Job, which I think is an interesting reading of Job. You're all familiar with the story of Job, right? There is a framework to Job, which is the narrative, and then the central, which is the first chapter and the last chapter, and the central piece of Job is a description of Job's concerns. The framework is that Satan comes to God and says, "Your wonderful servant Job," by the way, Job is not Jewish, "your wonderful servant Job is your wonderful servant because you've given him everything. You've given him wealth, you've given him power, you've given him position. You take that away and he will not be your wonderful crown prince any longer." And so God gives Satan permission to test Job. That's the framework. Now the rest of the story is how Job deals with all these terrible things that happen to him, including the death of his own children, disease, financial ruin, and he has these conversations then with three of his friends. Maimonides claims that through this we can read Job's evolution from anger at the beginning to his loss of everything, to a more profound faith. That Job rejects his earlier yearnings and he substitutes a new set of desires. He's exchanged, and through the development of the book of Job, we can see that he's exchanging his physical appetites for spiritual ones, and which relieves his own suffering, and he stops seeing his suffering as evil. That Job himself transforms evil into an idea, a human mental construct. And here I copied the sentence: the urge to consume the world causes suffering. The desire to understand the world brings happiness. That's pretty powerful there. The urge to consume the world causes suffering. The desire to understand the world brings happiness. Anybody want to take issue? Anybody want to fight with him? No, you're all happy with that?
Okay, no, I'm not happy with that. When we study these lessons from the Torah like that, and there's things involved like a game between God and Satan, and it murders the children of Job, it's very difficult to continue in my mind to believe in God. So my whole question behind everything that we're saying here is, if God is not involved, if God isn't this, if God isn't that, we're supposed to study ourselves and go inside and look at ourselves as human beings and understand the world and see the relativity of evil and good and all of that. What is the purpose of God? I always come back to that same question. Why do we even bother to believe that there is such thing as a God? It doesn't make any sense to me that there is God. It just seems like we have an earth that was started by God or something, and all the natural powers continue on earth, including how man behaves towards man, how we behave towards ourselves, natural disasters, everything is set in the heavens. It's all explained by science once the earth got started with the Big Bang. And now what is the point? I don't get the point anymore at all of why should I believe in this God? What is it?
Well, what answer? First of all, let me say I lost my video, so I can hear you all. I can't, and for whatever reason, I don't know how to get back to the video, but I can hear you. But I think he's in a trap. I think Maimonides is his logical understanding. Because there is no rhyme or reason. Why is it that certain people get cancer and other people don't get cancer? There's no rhyme or reason there. It's nothing that you've done. I mean, if we take away issues of smoking cigarettes and what we're doing to air pollution, et cetera, but there's no rhyme or reason. So, but we have this human, I think this very, very deep human need that things are not random. We don't want things, we don't want to look at the world as random. If anybody knows how to get me back to where I can see everybody, that would be great.
At the very bottom of your screen, there should be like a movie camera, and the movie camera might have a slash through it. And if you click on it, it will bring the video back.
No.
Do you have that at the bottom down there?
Yeah, it didn't have a slash through it, but there you are. Terrific. Thank you.
Needs a Mac.
The magic. That, in a sense, pain, suffering, and evil is something that we label as such. If only we were much smarter, more intelligent, we wouldn't necessarily see it as evil. We'd see our own responsibility in it. So Trudy and then Alan. Trudy?
Along with what Barbara said, that she can't see, and the need for God in all of this, there's also no need for religion because everything's decided by what we do.
Well, the issue is, do we have free will? If we don't have free will, then we're all puppets. If we do have free will, that's a very important concept in Judaism. Alan? Oh, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Trudy.
I was just going to say, it's not taking away free will. It's just that, according to what he says, it's whatever you do, and the consequences are your fault or your pleasure. And so,
if you're going to live in New Orleans, you got to expect that you're going to have hurricanes and be flooded.
Right.
So don't live in New Orleans. Right? If you're going to build a house on the Oregon coast, and it's a beautiful house because you have this wonderful view of the ocean, but the whole thing may cave in.
Yeah.
So the better part of valor would be, you want a house, get a house that's a little further removed, or don't go where there's tsunami warnings. And the question is, can you really live that way? Or the alternative is, when something happens and you say, I knew the risk, and therefore this is really not God punishing me. Alan?
Yeah, so I think Barbara's question is a very germane question, and I'm guessing we all struggle with that question. He seems to have a way of dealing with it. First of all, he believes very much in halakha, right? He spent 10 years of his life writing a book that basically translated halakha into something more practical for the times, that basically gave the answer as opposed to the debates. So he believes very much in it, and therefore he has to find a way to believe that there was a God at the very beginning that set the natural order that we're living under. And then he has to now explain things like his brother's drowning and all these things that happen, and even some of the miracles, which we haven't gotten to in the chapter, but he does that through this construct, which is very similar to the same construct he used for the earlier chapters. It's about intellectual perfection, right? And if you have proper balance and intellectual perfection, then you will be able to control the outcome. But what he's not doing is saying there's a God pulling strings behind the scenes, like some of the radical Islam that thought it was okay to drive a plane and kill 3,000 people, or that evil of the Holocaust could be explained in some way. There's no explanation for it, just as there's no explanation for why one person with the same environmental exposures gets cancer and one doesn't. Some of that is just the randomness that's built into the natural order, and it's just, you got to live with that. So he does that through this intellectual pursuit. But I think Barbara's question deserves more discussion, which is, this question of what is this God that he keeps going back to? and is that the same God in 2022 as we get ready to turn the calendar to the God that he saw in whatever year it was that he was living?
Yeah, certainly the circumstances have changed. Certainly, I think often of my parents and my grandparents who lived in, under very different circumstances. And of necessity, their God has to be different than my God. But I think that there's an awful lot that remains the same in that question. But I think that's, we will. I think throughout this class, that's the question. What is? Are we dealing with similar kinds of things in 2021-22? Are there points of connection between the 12th century and the 21st century? David? You have to unmute.
You'd think after 2 years I would have this down. And aside to what Mr. Plank said, I have a harder time explaining why a newborn is seriously deformed than I do with the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a human undertaking. It took a lot of humans to bring it about, but it was human activity that proceeded. I was struck by the quote beginning on page 49, where Maimonides is quoted as saying, the soul being a corporeal faculty. That addresses the mind-body problem at an early stage. I didn't appreciate. But if it's corporeal, it's matter. And it's a function of matter to decay right from the outset. And I think maybe what Maimonides is saying, once we're aware of this, we can try to make the proper decision to live well. And that Judaism provides a mechanism by which one can live well. Judaism understood, if you will, through a philosophical lens.
And at a certain point, I have my notes here where he talks about the purpose of halacha. I'll have to find it, but why this whole legal setup? What its purpose is? I'm not sure if that's in response exactly to the issue that you're raising, David, but the corporealness of the soul. I hope we'll get back to that. Alan?
And all these questions of suffering and why the suffering, I'm reminded of a question given to me by a Judaic scholar many, many years ago. And to paraphrase that question, it was, why did humankind need to invent God? And the thought of this individual was that since we don't have answers to so many of these questions, all the questions we've been asking today and for many of us many, many years, since we don't have answers, the thought was that we had to invent a God, and that therefore God does not exist without us. And I'm reminded of some of the prayers that we say on Yom Kippur, where, I can't remember which ones, unfortunately, where it's been explained to me that God needs us more than we need God. And so this question of us inventing God to help give us explanations. It both helps me and confuses me. And I'm wondering if you have any insight into that.
Our need for God. What do you say? God needs us more than we need God.
That's part of the learnings, the understandings that people have given me. And I'm not sure where that fits.
In fact, when God tells Moses that he's going to destroy this cantankerous people, Moses' argument is you can't do that because what are the Egyptians going to think? Your only exposure to the world is through us. You destroy us and you don't exist, which is a really unbelievable argument that comes from Moses in response to God. In other words, God, you're stuck with us because we are the transmitters of the evidence that you exist. From a Jewish point of view. Let me go on here because we're going to run out of time. He talks about 5 opinions about providence. Opinion number 1 is the denial of the existence of providence altogether. Everything in the world happens by chance. There's no order. And this is the Epicurean way of looking at the world. The Hebrew term for someone who is a non-believer is an apikoros.
Yeah.
Right? You call someone who is or someone who is not only a non-believer, somebody who's ignorant is called an apikoros, which means an Epicurean. Now, what is in fact, what was Epicurus about? Epicureanism is to be fond of or adapted to luxury, indulgence, and indulgence in sexual pleasures. Not sexual, sensual pleasures, sorry. So the first way of looking at providence is don't think about good and evil. It just or think of reasons for good and evil. It just is. The second opinion about providence is Aristotle's, where there's abundant natural order. God watches over certain things, and the rest is left to chance. That order, the fact that there is order in the universe, is evidence of a being that organizes the world. But according to Aristotle, there's no individual providence. God is not looking at down at us as individuals. Third view is that God is fully involved in the world. That everything that happens is God's will, and which denies the existence of the laws of nature. Right? There's a hurricane, God caused it. I'm sure I shared this before too, when the tsunami happened in Indonesia. You remember? I think 100,000 people were washed out to sea. And so I had from my former congregation a precocious bar mitzvah boy who was working for Reuters at the time of that. And he called me and he asked me to give a religious explanation for 100,000 people being washed out to sea. I tried to give him some order of Harold Kushner's when bad things happen to good people. I'm not sure it was very successful, but he called all kinds of religious leaders. He called me because he knew me, but he called all kinds of religious leaders, and the response that he got was shocking. I mean, probably not unexpected, but shocking. Why do 100,000 people get washed out to sea? It has to do with abortion.
Oh.
It has to do with homosexuality. It has to do with, but why 100,000 people in Indonesia, right? That's not where all the abortion is happening. That's not, if you want to hit the target, hit the target. So number 3 is where God is motivates everything, or is the source of everything. Then he gives opinion number 4, which is the opinion of the Torah and most sages, is that the laws of nature were set down, and we're subject to them. But miracles intrude intrude on nature. Although God is in the laws of nature, and sometimes breaks them. But God, the traditional Jewish view is God is constrained by moral, what did I write? By moral considerations, and therefore will not reward the wicked or punish the good. That they say is 4, and 5 is his view. For humans, divine providence holds. Human beings receive their just deserts. For animals and plants, everything is subject to nature, which is Aristotle's view of pretty much everything. God does not distinguish between the righteous and the wicked, but between the wise and the foolish. Right here, the same theme again. The closer you are to rational purification, perfection, the more God's we will hear the more God's providential concern. That's this is the consistent theme, right? So let me say it again. The closer an individual is to rational perfection, the more the more he or she will feel God's providential concern. God does not prevent disasters, but God provides, but God's providence is manifested in preventing persons from doing stupid and dangerous things. God does not uproot the laws of nature, but he protects the wise through their minds. So in other words, his explanation for his brother was, of course, his brother was in a dangerous profession. And although he was his brother and loved, he was doing dangerous things and he knew it. As I went through these, anybody remember reading a book called The Bridge of San? Maybe read that book. You remember what that book is all about? This is a book about, I think it's 5 people who walk across a dangerous bridge. The bridge breaks. The 5 people, I think all 5 people die. Right? Susan, do I have that wrong?
The Bridge of St. Louis Ray, is that the book? Yeah.
So Thornton Wilder. So the book is about the biographies of these 5 people and why each and every one of them, for some reason, deserved to die, deserved to be punished. You know, on some level, it's a very deeply religious book, but deeply religious with the idea that God is entirely in control of reward and punishment. And those people who deserve it, get it, which is, of course, not our experience. So these are the 5 from everywhere from God's not in control of anything to God's in control of everything. That's 1 and 3. To God's in control of some things, but not all things. To the Jewish view, where there is reward and punishment, though the laws of nature are natural law exists, and God set it in motion, and whatever happens. To Maimonides, who now divides, first of all, humans from animal and plant life. Animal and plant life is not subject to the laws of reward and punishment, but human beings are, except that God is not distinguishing between the righteous and the wicked, but between those who have rational perfection or try to reach for rational perfection versus those who are either lazy or stupid or whatever other terms he would use. Alan, did you want to add something? No. Okay. Michael?
Yeah. This was raised to a certain extent earlier, but I'm troubled by, the case of the child who hasn't even reached a point where they are thinking in rational terms like we are and can't really make choices for him or herself, and how all this applies. And it seems like it couldn't possibly apply to them, and therefore it tends to undermine the entire argument as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, I'm very moved by these commercials for St. Jude and for the Shriners Hospital. Have you seen these commercials? These lovely children who were born with all kinds of, in this case, physical deformities or issues. And, you say, that's not fair. But, even those of us, thankfully, that have been born what we call healthy, there's still all kinds of distinctions. Some of us have, some of us are prodigies in various ways, and most of us are not. Some of us really have artistic ability and artistic sensitivity, and others do not. So even when we're all born equal, and equal, I mean, with 10 fingers and 10 toes, it's not equal. It's really all different. So the end of this chapter, our author gives his own evaluation. He says, first of all, the problem with all of this, with Maimonides' thinking, is it's not our life experience. In many cases, the wise suffer and the ignorant don't suffer. And he goes on to several contradictions with Ibn Tibbon, who tries to argue through one of these contradictions, but creates other contradictions in the process. So how do we resolve all of this? And our author tells us we have to go back to evil. It's not that the enlightened do not experience harmful incidents, but they do not experience such events as harmful. The knowledge of God frees them from dependence on this world. Love of God will love of God will bring us to the place where we can enjoy total perfection. Love of God saves people from emotional dependence on anything else in the world, and therefore suffering is subjective. I think of, I had a congregant, my previous congregation named Alan Kaiser. Alan was an engineer. No, Alan was a lawyer actually, but what he loved doing was engineering. I don't know if you know, all up and down in New York, on the coast, there are these national trust buildings. And Alan would be part of a crew that would go on these and look at what some of the architectural problems were. Well, Alan was in South Carolina. This is an actual incident in South Carolina on a scaffold, and the scaffold collapsed. Alan was severely injured. He was in the hospital for 6 months, but the fellow who was on the scaffold with him died. And I remember Alan telling me that he had a conversation with the parents of the young person who died, who said to him, now, I don't know that any of us could have said the same thing, but the parents said to him, if one of the two of you had to die, it was better that it was our son, because after all, you're married and you have young children and they have to be taken care of. And this was their way of dealing with the terrible loss of their son from a building collapse or a scaffold collapse. And I'm wondering whether it's this kind of thing that Maimonides is talking about, that somehow love of God will help us retranslate certain things that happen to us, or simply help us through them, which is really something that comes from, is where Harold Kushner ends up at the end too. That what is God's role? God's role is not to prevent evil things from happening. God can't do that. But that God's role is to help us recover. God's role is to help us face the world again. That once we've dealt with the loss of a life's partner, horrible things that can happen to us, that it's God who is God through prayer, through community, through observance, through practice, that can help us face life anew. So I'm wondering if we get a confluence here of Harold Kushner on the one hand and Maimonides as coming from two very different perspectives into the same. Again, love of God will allow us to enjoy total protection, and love of God saves a person from emotional dependence on anything else in the world, and that suffering is subjective. Final thoughts?
doesn't seem like you need God for that. All of what you described there could be a human construct, and allow us. That's all stuff that we could do without God being there. I think I'm not sure how God is necessary for that frame of mind.
Yes, you can, but you're talking about doing it in your own mind. And I think what he's saying is this is being done, that the benefit is through observance, practice, prayer, community, not being alone.
Agreed. And I think that's why many of us are involved in the religion and in the practice and in the tradition, and all those things reinforce that. But I'm just saying that I'm not sure where God necessarily fits into that as being required.
Michael, you're talking ethical culture, which was founded by a Jewish guy, by the way. In other words, having community. But even there's no tradition there. There's no practice there. There's no community. I mean, there's a community, but
interestingly, when I was a child, my parents were members of the Ethical Cultural Society, the Humanist Society here in Portland. So maybe some of that was ingrained in me from an early age.
Yeah, in other words, all this can be done, I haven't heard about them in a long time, but there's a humanistic synagogue in Portland.
There is.
This is Judaism. God. By the way, when the humanistic synagogue, not here in Portland, but another community, worship in the
Frozen.
His network's acting up.
You're frozen.
Breaking up, yeah.
I'm frozen.
You're frozen.
Right, yeah.
Frozen, yeah.
Can you hear us?
There you are.
I'm not frozen.
baby.
I can't.
Yeah. Wait. Yep. Move. Nope.
Okay.
Not okay.
Not okay.
Okay. Okay. So, but you can hear me.
Yes.
Lisa?
Well, I guess in response to what Michael was raising, the way I read this chapter was, I think Maimonides would say, and what we've read so far, I think, and you guys can correct me, my impression of what Maimonides would say would be in moving towards perfection, so you're saying it's a human, God is a human construct. He'd say somehow that perfection, intellectual perfection and balance that you reach, that is providence acting within you, or God acting within you, right? I think that's how I read it. And so, I don't know how you argue with that, because if you accept his premise, he's just saying, yes, what you're talking about is what I'm talking about too. Anyway, that's my comment.
Okay. Yeah. Trudy?
Well, my experience is quite different. My sister lost her husband in an automobile accident and left her with 3 young children. And instead of bringing me closer to God, it drove me far, far away. And I didn't come back for many, many years. And the thing that brought me back more was when I moved to the ocean in California, and nature brought me back, just seeing that couldn't have all happened, the waves and the tides and everything, without some order. But it certainly didn't bring me closer.
My grandfather, who been a World War I hero in the German army. He was evidently wore the Iron Cross. He really took a negative view of my going to rabbinical school, partly it was that his country had turned against him, and it was very, very painful. So, Trudy, well, how would Maimonides deal with this tragedy? Yeah, go ahead.
Well, by the way, my brother-in-law was a rabbi and a cantor, so he was a good person, and it made it even more difficult for me that someone like that would be taken that way.
Because you're beginning with the idea that God should have somehow prevented something like this from happening to a good family and a young family with children.
Right.
And Maimonides would say, God doesn't prevent those things.
I have a problem with that, I guess.
Yeah, well, you're not alone. In those 5 listings, you can choose really any one of them. But we're studying Maimonides. I think we're over time already. So I'm going to leave it open if people want to